I stood in the Riverside ballroom for my brother's engagement, smiling like a guest in my own family, while my parents paraded him like a trophy and acted like I was background music 2 hours of being ignored. Again, then Aunt June flew in, hugged me, and said, loud as a toast, "So, are you loving that $1.8 million house you bought?" The room froze. My mom's champagne stopped midair. My dad's smile died, and my brother looked at me. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. I'm going to take you straight back to the beginning of that night, because people always think these moments happen out of nowhere, like lightning just randomly strikes a family dinner. But nah, this kind of explosion is always years in the making. It's just that nobody notices the fuse because the family's been stepping on your face so long they think that's normal. So picture this, the Riverside Ballroom downtown, the kind of place that looks like it was designed specifically to make broke. People feel like they shouldn't breathe too loudly, crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, gold trim on the walls, a champagne fountain that looks like a rich person's bathtub, and servers gliding around like human ghosts holding trays of hors d'oeuvres so small they should come with an apology. And everyone is dressed like they're auditioning to be successful instead of actually being successful. And that detail matters because this whole night is built on appearances. That's the entire Reed family religion. Look good, sound good, post good, never admit you're bleeding. My brother, the star of the night, stood in the center of it all, suit fitted, haircut sharp, laughing too loud like he's the CEO of Oxygen, and his fiancée is clinging to his arm with that "I just won the lottery" smile. And my parents are floating from group to group like they're running a campaign, shaking hands, collecting compliments, soaking up attention like sponges that only absorb praise. And me, I'm standing near the bar with a glass of wine I didn't even like, just something to keep my hands busy, because when you're the invisible child, you learn to look occupied so nobody asks why you're alone. And I wish I could tell you I walked in there confident and unbothered, but the truth is, I came with that stupid little flicker of hope I always hated myself for. The one that says maybe tonight they'll see you, maybe tonight they'll ask, maybe tonight they'll introduce you like you matter. And the worst part is knowing you're foolish for still wanting that and wanting it anyway, because no matter how grown you are, that abandoned part of you still shows up to family events like a stray dog hoping for scraps. And right away, the pattern started. My mother spots me, gives me a smile that's just polite enough to count as motherly if someone's watching, then immediately turns away to gush over my brother's engagement story like it's the discovery of fire. My father barely nods at me, then launches into a loud, proud speech to some stranger about how our son is really going places. And I'm standing there thinking, you have 2 children, you absolute hypocrite. But I swallow it because swallowing it is what I've done my entire life. And that's the first betrayal you don't even realize is betrayal. The fact that they train you to tolerate crumbs and call it love. And the guests, oh, the guests, they're the worst kind. The kind that don't mean harm, but still do it. Because they mirror whatever energy the parents set. So if your parents treat you like background, everyone else does too. People walk past me to get to my brother. People bump my shoulder and don't even apologize. People ask, "So how do you know the groom?" As if I'm not literally the same blood. And the wild thing is I could have corrected them. I could have said, "I'm his sibling," but I already knew what would happen. They'd look surprised, then awkward, then say something like, "Oh wow, he didn't mention you." And that would sting more than silence. So I just let it happen, because sometimes silence hurts less than confirmation. And while this is all happening, I watch my parents perform like they always do. My mom is laughing too hard at jokes that aren't funny. My dad is doing that thing where he touches his jacket button and nods like he's in a board meeting. Both of them acting like this event is proof they raised a winner, and my brother is soaking it up because he's been trained to think love equals applause. And I know him. I know that smile. It's not joy, it's hunger. It's that deep need to be validated. And guess who taught him that? My parents. And guess who paid the price for that? Me. Because in families like this, love isn't a blanket, it's a spotlight. And if you're not under it, you're freezing. And about an hour in, I'm standing near a group of my mother's friends, and I hear it. The same old narrative, the same old rigged scoreboard. My mom is telling them how my brother worked so hard and never asked for anything and always took care of the family, which is hilarious because my brother has asked for everything his whole life, but my mom says it like scripture, and one of the friends asks, "And what about your other child?" And my mother pauses just long enough for my stomach to tighten. Then she smiles and goes, "Oh, she's independent." And that one word hits like a slap because independent is what parents call you when they don't want to admit they abandoned you. Independent is the pretty label they slap on neglect so nobody questions it. Independent means you learn to stop asking, you learn to stop needing, you learn to stop expecting. And I'm standing right there hearing my mother summarize my entire existence like a footnote, and my brother doesn't notice, because why would he? He's busy being celebrated like a king, and I'm thinking, this is the family dynamic in one sentence. He's the headline, I'm the fine print, and that's when my brain does this thing it always does. It starts replaying the greatest hits of betrayal like a playlist I didn't ask for. The birthdays where they forgot my cake, but remembered my brother's soccer banquets. The graduations where they couldn't make it, but somehow showed up for my brother's work award like it was the Oscars. The phone calls where I tried to share something important and they redirected the conversation back to him in under 60 seconds. And it's not even the big events that hurt the most. It's the tiny moments, the casual dismissals. The way your father can remember your brother's favorite brand of shoes, but can't remember what city you live in. The way your mother can name your brother's girlfriend's dog, but can't name your job title. That's the kind of neglect that rewires you because it teaches you you're only lovable when you're useful. And for a long time, I tried to become useful in ways they couldn't ignore. I tried achievement. I tried being the good one. I tried being calm and helpful and never a problem. But the truth is, they didn't want another star. They wanted a supporting character. And I filled that role for years until I got tired of clapping for people who wouldn't clap for me. And that's the part they didn't see. The moment I stopped auditioning for their love. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a big speech. It was quiet. It happened in my own head. In the middle of a random day when I realized I was working my tail off and still felt like a stranger in my own family. So I stopped updating them, stopped seeking approval, stopped trying to prove myself to a jury that had already decided the verdict. And what's funny is the moment you stop chasing them, that's when they notice you exist, not because they miss you, but because they miss what you used to do for them. And I didn't plan to bring any of that baggage into the ballroom that night. I promised myself I'd just show up, smile, be polite, disappear, fly back home and go back to my real life. The life I built without them. But standing there watching them glow over my brother like he personally invented engagement rings, something in me started to simmer, not jealousy, because I wasn't jealous of him. I was furious at the system, furious at the rigged game my parents ran, furious at the hypocrisy because they loved preaching family loyalty when it benefited them, but when it came to me, loyalty became optional. And right when I'm having that internal meltdown with a calm face, that's when Aunt June walks in, late, loud, and completely unaware she's about to punch a hole in the entire family lie. Aunt June is my father's sister, and she's the type of woman who doesn't enter a room. She arrives, you hear her laugh before you see her, you smell her perfume from 5 feet away, and she hugs people like she's reclaiming property. And the second she sees me, she makes a beeline and listen. I'm not used to being approached first at family events, so even that threw me off. She grabs my hands, looks me in the eyes, and says, "There you are, sweetheart, I've been dying to see you." And right there I felt that weird tightness in my chest, because affection from family should not feel surprising. But when you've been starved, even basic kindness feels like a shock, and she starts asking about my work, asking about travel, asking about life like I matter. And I'm answering carefully because part of me is still conditioned to downplay, to shrink, to not make my brother's night about me. And then she says it casually, loudly, like it's the most normal thing in the world. "So tell me, are you enjoying that $1.8 million house you bought? Or are you still thinking of upgrading?" And I swear to you, the air in the ballroom changed. It wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum, like sound got sucked out of the room. People stopped chewing, stopped laughing, stopped pretending. My mother's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips like she got paused. My father's smile collapsed like a cheap tent. And my brother's face did this slow glitch, like his brain was trying to load a file that didn't exist. Because in their version of reality, I was supposed to be independent, meaning struggling quietly, renting some small place, doing something fine, nothing exciting, nothing threatening, nothing that would outshine the golden child. And now Aunt June had just announced, in front of everybody, that I owned a house worth more than most people will make in a decade. And it wasn't just the money, it was what the money represented. That they had been wrong about me, that they hadn't been paying attention, that their entire story about our family had holes in it. And you could see panic flash in my mother's eyes because she cares more about appearances than truth. And this truth was about to ruin the picture she'd been painting all night. My father stepped in fast, too fast, with that fake laugh, that let's smooth this over laugh. And he goes, "June, you must be mistaken." And Aunt June squints at him like he said the dumbest thing she's heard all week, and she goes, "Mistaken? I stayed there last summer. It's gorgeous. That view is insane." And she turns back to me, smiling, totally innocent. "You've done such a good job with it." And my brother's fiancée, bless her, leans in and whispers, "Wait, you have a house!" Like she's not sure if she heard right. And my brother's eyes are locked on me now, hard searching, because in his head this is an ambush. He's thinking I planned this. He's thinking I'm trying to steal attention. And I'm standing there realizing I'm about to be blamed for a truth I didn't even speak. And before I could answer, my mother finally finds her voice and she says, "Too sweet, too sharp. What house, honey?" Like she's asking a toddler where they put the cookies. And I looked at her. And in that split second, I had a choice. I could lie to protect her image. I could laugh it off and shrink myself. I could keep the peace. Or I could tell the truth and let the consequences hit whoever deserved them. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't choose truth because I'm some hero. I chose truth because I was tired. I was tired of being edited, tired of being reduced, tired of being the family's invisible backup plan. And I said calmly, clearly, "Yes, I bought a house years ago," and my father's face tightened like I'd slapped him in public, and my brother's jaw clenched, and you could feel everyone leaning in. Because rich people love drama even more than poor people do. They just whisper it, and my mother tries to regain control by making it sound like a misunderstanding. "Sweetheart, why wouldn't you tell us?" And I almost laughed, because that question is the definition of gaslighting, like I hadn't tried, like they hadn't ignored me every time I spoke, like their neglect was just a communication error. And I looked at her and said, "I did tell you, you didn't listen." And you could feel the blow land, because now it's not about the house. It's about the parenting. It's about the years. It's about the public exposure of something they kept private, their failure. And my brother finally speaks, voice tight. "Why are we hearing about this from Aunt June?" And I said, "Because Aunt June asks questions." And the room made this little collective sound, like half shock, half suppressed laughter, because everyone in that ballroom understood exactly what I meant. And my father's eyes flicked around, scanning the crowd, calculating damage, because that's what men like him do. They don't feel shame, they feel risk. And he says, "We should talk about this later." That classic line, the one parents use when they don't want the truth to have witnesses. But the truth already had witnesses now. And Aunt June, still oblivious, claps her hands and goes, "Oh, and I meant to tell you, I ran into one of your colleagues at that conference. He said your work is changing lives." And my mother's face goes paler, because now it's not just the house. It's status, it's prestige, it's success, and the worst part, it's success they didn't get to claim because they didn't even know, and I could see it in her eyes, this sudden scramble to rewrite the narrative, to act like they've always supported me, to pretend they're proud. And I'm standing there thinking, here it comes, the flip, the switch, the moment the same parents who ignored me will start using my achievements like accessories. But first they have to survive the humiliation of being exposed as parents who don't even know their own child. And right then, my brother's fiancé says something innocent like, "That's amazing, congratulations." And my mother snaps, "Of course it is, she's always been driven." Like she's trying to take credit retroactively. And that's when I knew the night was about to go somewhere ugly, because my brother wasn't just embarrassed, he was threatened, and my parents weren't just shocked, they were cornered. And when people like that feel cornered, they don't apologize, they attack, they look for a villain, and guess who the easiest villain is? The quiet one who finally spoke. And as the ballroom noise slowly tried to restart around us, I felt it, the shift, the moment. The family stopped seeing me as background and started seeing me as a problem. And the worst part is, the house wasn't even the real secret. The house was just the appetizer, because the reason I never pushed to be seen by them wasn't only because they ignored me. It was because I learned something about my parents a few years back that made me keep my distance for safety, financial safety, and once that truth comes out, The engagement party won't be the only thing that collapses, because the next part of this story isn't about my success. It's about their desperation and what they were hiding behind those perfect smiles. So tell me this before we go further: if your parents ignored you for years and then suddenly acted shocked when they found out you were thriving, would you forgive them, or would you let them sit in the consequences? Because you're going to see exactly why my parents panicked that night, and why my brother's engagement wasn't just a celebration, it was a cover. And when I realized what they were really doing, I swear to you, my stomach dropped. The moment that question left my mouth and the room shifted from awkward curiosity into something darker, I felt it in my body first before my brain caught up. That tight coil in your stomach, like your instincts just tripped an alarm your logic hasn't processed yet. Because up until that point, everyone was still pretending this was just a funny misunderstanding, a quirky family moment. But the way my mother's eyes darted, the way my father's jaw locked, the way my brother's smile flattened into something sharp and calculating, that wasn't embarrassment anymore, that was panic, and panic only shows up when someone feels exposed or threatened. And that's when the real story started. Not the house, not the money, not Aunt June accidentally detonating the family lie, but the thing my parents were quietly trying to keep buried under all that champagne and fake laughter. Because here's the truth: most people don't understand about families that worship appearances. They don't just hide weaknesses, they hide messes, financial messes, reputation messes, moral messes, the kind that collapse if even one wrong light gets turned on. And suddenly I realized my existence itself had become a light they couldn't control anymore. My father cleared his throat and said, "We should really move this conversation somewhere private." That classic control phrase, the adult version of "go to your room." And I watched how his shoulders squared like he was bracing for impact, and something inside me went cold. Not angry, not sad, just cold clarity, because I'd seen that posture before in boardrooms and negotiations, the posture of someone trying to contain damage, not someone trying to understand truth. And my brother immediately backed him up, cutting in with that performative laugh that sounds friendly but carries teeth underneath it. Yeah, let's not turn this into a circus." And that word, circus, landed like an accusation, like I was the one causing a scene simply by existing visibly. And you could see his fiancée glancing between us, confused, sensing tension but not understanding its source. And Aunt June finally picked up on the shift too, her brows knitting together like she realized she'd stepped on a landmine she didn't know was buried. We drifted toward a quieter corner near the balcony doors, not because I wanted privacy, but because my parents were already steering the narrative physically, hurting bodies like chess pieces. And as we moved, I noticed something else that made my skin prickle: the way several guests lingered nearby, pretending to sip drinks while clearly eavesdropping, because rich people love other people's dysfunction when it disrupts perfection. And that added pressure matters, because when shame gets witnesses, people stop being rational and start being dangerous in small, manipulative ways. My mother leaned in first, voice low but tight. "Sweetheart, this really isn't the time." And I almost laughed again, because when is it ever the time to tell the truth in families like mine? There's always a birthday coming up, a holiday, a promotion, a wedding, some event that conveniently makes honesty inconvenient. And I said quietly, "Then when is the time?" And she opened her mouth and closed it again, because she didn't actually have an answer that didn't expose the pattern, and that's when my brother snapped, "You could have told us privately instead of embarrassing everyone." And there it was, the blame transfer, the classic move where the person who benefited from silence accuses the truth teller of causing damage. And something in me finally hardened, because this wasn't about embarrassment, this was about control slipping out of his hands. This was about the golden child realizing the spotlight might shift. And I said, "I didn't announce anything. Aunt June asked me a question." And he fired back, "You didn't have to answer it like that." And I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Answer honestly." And the pause that followed was electric, because now the argument wasn't about manners, it was about whether honesty itself was allowed in this family if it disrupted hierarchy. My father stepped in again, trying to assert dominance the way men like him always do when emotional complexity makes them uncomfortable. "Enough, we'll talk about this later." And I surprised myself by shaking my head slowly and saying, "No, you won't." And the shock on his face was almost comical, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't automatically obeying his authority tone. And he stared at me like I'd broken some invisible contract he thought we both signed at birth. And that's when something clicked in my mind, like puzzle pieces sliding into place, because I suddenly remembered the phone call from 2 months earlier. The one I'd brushed off at the time because I was busy, my mother sounding stressed, asking vague questions about investment returns, property values, liquidity, pretending it was just curiosity, but now replaying it in my head with fresh context. I realized those weren't random questions. Those were panic questions, the kind people ask when they're trying to calculate how much runway they have before a problem explodes. And suddenly the house revelation wasn't just threatening their image. It was threatening their contingency plan, because they had assumed I was financially insignificant, invisible, harmless, and now that assumption had shattered publicly. My mother's voice dropped even lower. "Can we please not do this here?" And I said, "Do what? Acknowledge reality." And she winced like I'd slapped her, because for people like her, reality is optional until it becomes inconvenient, and my brother leaned closer, eyes sharp now. "What are you trying to prove?" And that question hit me in the chest, because it revealed his worldview perfectly. Everything is a competition to him. Every interaction is a power move. Someone wins, someone loses. Someone gets attention, someone gets erased, and I said slowly, "I'm not trying to prove anything." And I meant it. I'm just answering a question. And the truth is, that answer scared him more than any aggressive speech ever could, because it meant I wasn't playing his game anymore. And that's when my father's phone buzzed in his pocket, and I watched his face shift as he read the screen. Just a flicker of tension crossing his eyes before he masked it, but I caught it, and my instinct screamed again, louder this time, because that wasn't a casual message, that was stress, and he excused himself a few steps away to answer it, turning his back slightly, and I watched his shoulders tense even more as he spoke in hushed tones, nodding, rubbing his forehead, the universal body. Language of someone dealing with a problem they can't publicly admit, and my mother noticed too, her eyes tracking him nervously, and my brother followed his gaze like a hawk, and suddenly the house conversation felt like smoke while the real fire was happening somewhere else. Aunt June, bless her unfiltered soul, leaned toward me and whispered, "Did I say something wrong?" And I smiled sadly and said, "No, you said something true." And she tilted her head, studying me, and said quietly, "They don't look like people who like the truth." And I almost laughed again, because she nailed it in one sentence better than years of therapy ever could. My father came back, face tight, jaw clenched, and said, "We need to leave soon," which made no sense because this was their golden child's engagement party, the crown jewel of their social calendar. And the idea of them leaving early sent another wave of alarm through me. And my brother immediately protested, "What? Why?" And my father shot him a look that shut him up instantly, and my mother stepped in with forced brightness. "We'll talk about this later, sweetheart," squeezing my arm a little too tightly, like she was trying to reassert control physically since she'd lost it emotionally. And that's when I realized something ugly. They weren't just embarrassed, they were scared of something outside this room, something bigger than family drama, something that made their social performance suddenly less important than damage control. And I felt that old survival instinct kick in, the one that kept me emotionally distant for years, the one that whispered, "You're not safe." In this dynamic, keep your distance, observe, don't volunteer information. And I leaned back against the balcony railing and let them scramble without helping, because for once I wasn't responsible for managing their chaos. A few minutes later, my mother pulled me aside alone, away from my brother and Aunt June, her voice trembling slightly now, the mask cracking. "You really didn't have to say all that." And I looked at her and said, "All I said was that I own a house." And she shook her head, frustrated. "You know what I mean." And that's when I finally let some truth slip through, not cruel, not loud, just honest. "No, I don't know what you mean. Because, from my perspective, you've spent years acting like my life doesn't exist. So when someone mentions something real about me, it shouldn't feel like a crisis." And her eyes filled with tears instantly, the emotional shield she always used when she felt cornered, the kind that shifts the conversation from accountability to comfort. And I didn't move to console her this time, because I was tired of being the emotional janitor for messes I didn't create, and she whispered, We've always been proud of you. And that lie slid out so smoothly it scared me. A little, because I knew she believed it in her own warped way. Pride without presence, pride without curiosity, pride without involvement, the empty kind that lets parents sleep at night without confronting their neglect. And I said quietly, if that were true, you'd know what I do for a living. And that landed like a gut punch because she couldn't answer. She just stared at me, lips trembling, eyes darting away. And in that silence, everything unsaid screamed louder than words ever could. My brother reappeared then, visibly irritated, tension rolling off him in waves. We're leaving, he announced sharply, not asking, declaring, like he was trying to regain authority over the night. And his fiancée looked confused and disappointed, whispering, already, but he brushed her off. And that's when something shifted again inside me, because suddenly I saw the chain clearly. My parents weren't leaving because they were embarrassed by me. They were leaving because something else had spooked them badly enough to override their obsession with appearances, and my curiosity flared hard, because whatever it was, it involved urgency, secrecy, and fear, and those three together never point to something harmless. As they gathered their things, my father avoided my eyes completely. My mother kept giving me these tight, anxious glances like she wanted to say something, but didn't dare. And my brother looked like he was swallowing 1,000 unspoken accusations. And I stayed put, leaning against the railing, sipping my wine slowly, letting them go, without chasing, without apologizing, without shrinking myself. And for the first time in my life, I felt oddly grounded in the middle of their chaos, like I'd stepped out of a storm into clear air. Aunt June hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering, "Call me tomorrow." And I nodded, grateful for at least one adult in this family who functioned like a human being. And as they disappeared into the elevator crowd, the ballroom noise gradually returned to normal, laughter swelling back in, glasses clinking, music swelling, as if nothing had happened, and that contrast was surreal, because inside my body something had cracked open that wasn't going back. I stood there for a few more minutes, watching strangers dance and celebrate love while my own family quietly imploded off stage. And I felt this strange mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the truth was finally out in the open. Unease because I could tell this wasn't over, not even close. This was just the opening fracture. My phone buzzed in my pocket a few minutes later. A text from my father. "We'll talk soon." And that message sent another chill through me. Because it wasn't an apology, it wasn't curiosity, it wasn't concern, it was a statement of control. Like a manager scheduling a disciplinary meeting, and my instinct screamed again, louder now. This isn't about reconciliation, this is about damage control. This is about leverage. And here's where I'm going to be honest with you, in a way most people won't admit. Part of me wanted to ignore it, fly home. Go back to my quiet life, pretend this night was just another weird family moment. But another part of me, the part that had been invisible for years, wanted answers, wanted to finally understand what my parents had been hiding behind all those forced smiles and golden child worship. Because something didn't add up, the sudden urgency, the phone call, the rush to leave, the anxiety in my mother's eyes, the way my father looked like someone whose chessboard just got flipped. And I could feel in my bones that whatever it was, it involved money, control, and fear. The holy trinity of family secrets. I left the ballroom shortly after them, stepping out into the cool night air, letting the city noise ground me. The smell of car exhaust and street food and damp concrete reminding me I was real. I existed outside that toxic bubble. And as I waited for my ride, my phone buzzed again, this time from Aunt June. "They're in trouble," she texted, and my heart thudded hard in my chest, because that confirmed everything my instincts had been screaming. And I typed back, "What kind of trouble?" And the 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, the digital version of hesitation, and then her message came through, "Financial, and they didn't want you to know." And I stared at the screen, feeling that cold clarity deepen, because suddenly the pieces locked together. The house revelation didn't just threaten their image. It threatened their fallback plan, their unspoken safety net, because in their minds, the invisible child was supposed to be the easy one, the low-risk one, the one who wouldn't complicate things with independence or boundaries. And now they just realized the invisible child had power, autonomy, and options, and that terrified them. And here's where I want you to pause with me for a second, because this part matters for anyone who's ever been the overlooked one in a family. Have you ever noticed how the moment you stop needing them, they suddenly start paying attention? Not because they love you more, but because you're no longer predictable, no longer controllable, no longer filling the role they assigned you. And that scares people who rely on rigid family hierarchies, because your growth threatens their narrative, their leverage, their comfort. Standing there under the streetlight outside that ballroom, phone glowing in my hand, I realized this night wasn't about my house. It wasn't about Aunt June. It wasn't even about my brother's engagement. It was about the moment the family life finally cracked open, and whatever was underneath it was about to spill into my life whether I wanted it or not. Because once secrets start leaking, they rarely stop politely, they flood. And the next wave was coming fast, because you're going to see exactly what my parents were hiding, why they suddenly needed control back, and how the truth about their finances turned me from the invisible child into the leverage they never expected. And trust me, when I saw the numbers for myself, my hands actually started shaking. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was anxious in the usual nervous way, but because my brain wouldn't stop running simulations like a supercomputer trying to predict outcomes, replaying every micro-expression on my parents' faces, every clipped sentence, every unnatural urgency. And once you start seeing patterns, you can't unsee them, especially when you've spent years being the invisible observer in your own family, quietly studying behavior because no one bothered studying you. And around 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, just a short message from Aunt June that said, "Call me when you wake up. It's worse than I thought." And that sentence sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the night, because when someone like Aunt June, who has lived through 3 recessions, 2 divorces, and 1 spectacular corporate scandal, says something is worse than she thought, you don't brush that off as drama. You prepare for impact. By 7:30 a.m., I was pacing my kitchen with coffee in hand, sunlight cutting across the countertops. That quiet, clean silence of my own home grounding me in reality, reminding me that no matter what chaos my family was hiding, I still had control over my own life. And I finally called her, putting the phone on speaker as I leaned against the counter, because some conversations deserve your full attention. And she answered immediately, like she'd been waiting for the vibration. "They're drowning," she said without preamble, no warm-up, no pleasantries, straight to the gut punch, and I felt my shoulders tighten automatically. That instinctive brace your body does before your mind catches up. And I said, "In what way?" keeping my voice calm even though my pulse had started climbing, because emotional control has always been my armor in this family. She exhaled slowly like she'd been holding the information all night and finally letting it out. Your parents over-leveraged themselves trying to keep up appearances, multiple investment losses, refinanced the house twice, borrowed against retirement accounts. They're upside down. And the reason your dad got that call last night was because one of their lenders accelerated the repayment timeline, and for a second my brain actually stalled, like a buffering wheel spinning, because the words were heavy but abstract until they started stacking into a picture. And that picture was not pretty. I asked how bad, and she hesitated again, which told me the answer before she even said it. If nothing changes, they could lose the house within 6 months. And there it was, the invisible earthquake, finally registering on the Richter scale of my nervous system, because suddenly all the panic, the urgency, the attempt to control the narrative, the sudden need to leave the engagement party made horrifying sense. They weren't embarrassed about me, they were terrified about themselves. And that realization flipped something inside me. Not rage, not satisfaction, just cold awareness. Because when people are desperate, they stop acting like parents and start acting like survivalists. I thanked Aunt June, hung up, and stood there staring out the window at my quiet street, the contrast between my stability and their impending collapse almost surreal, like watching a storm from the safety of a bunker. And here's the uncomfortable truth that slid into my mind next, the kind of thought you don't say out loud because it makes you sound heartless even when it's honest. Part of me felt relieved, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because for once the chaos wasn't happening. Inside me, it wasn't my emotions, my insecurities, my invisibility being crushed. It was their illusion finally cracking under its own weight. About an hour later, my mother called, and this time I answered because now I knew the real stakes, and her voice sounded brittle, tired, stripped of last night's forced composure, like someone who'd been crying into a pillow for hours and ran out of tears. "We need to talk," she said quietly, and I replied, "I know," because I did, and she paused, caught off guard by that. "You know," she repeated, and I didn't explain yet. Because sometimes letting people reveal themselves is more powerful than confronting them with facts they're not ready to face. And she said, "Can you come by today?" And I asked, "Why?" And another pause, heavier this time, longer, and finally she said, "We're in trouble." And the honesty in that cracked voice almost made me soften. Almost, but then the rest of the sentence landed. "And we don't know what to do?" And there was again the subtle shift of responsibility, the unspoken expectation that the invisible child would now step in as the solution, the emotional safety net they never bothered maintaining when I needed it. I agreed to come by in the afternoon, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see the truth with my own eyes, wanted to watch the mask fully come off. And when I pulled into their driveway later that day, the house looked exactly the same from the outside. Manicured lawn, polished entryway, the picture-perfect facade of suburban success, and that visual irony wasn't lost on me, because the prettiest houses often hide the messiest balance sheets, and my father opened the door. Before I even knocked, his posture stiff, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, and for a split second I saw him, not as my intimidating, authoritative parent, but as a tired man who had run out of runway. We sat at the kitchen table where so many of my childhood silences were manufactured. My mother twisting her hands in her lap, my father staring at the wood grain like it might give him answers. And I waited, because silence makes liars uncomfortable. And eventually my mother broke it. "We made some bad financial decisions," she said, and I nodded slowly. "I know." And again that startled them. My father looking up sharply. "You know," he echoed. And this time I told the truth. Aunt June told me. And something flickered across his face, not anger at her, but fear at being exposed. And he exhaled heavily, slumping slightly in his chair like the weight of the lie had finally become too heavy to carry. They started explaining in fragments, overlapping sentences, half confessions, half justifications, investments that promised high returns, a friend of a friend opportunity, trying to maintain a lifestyle that matched their social circle, refinancing to cover gaps, using credit to bridge losses. All the classic traps people fall into when image matters more than math. And as they spoke, something strange happened inside me. I wasn't shocked, I wasn't outraged, I was clinical, listening like I would in a strategy meeting or risk assessment, mentally calculating exposure, timelines, probability of recovery, because this is what happens when you grow up learning not to rely on emotional safety. You develop analytical safety instead. My father finally said the part they'd been circling. "We may need help." And he couldn't quite look at me when he said it, like his pride was choking the words halfway out. And my mother added softly, "We don't want to burden you," which would have sounded noble if it hadn't been immediately followed by, "But you're doing well, and family helps family." And there it was, the contract they never honored when I needed emotional support, suddenly being invoked when they needed financial support. And something inside me hardened again. Not cruel, just clear. I asked calmly, "How much?" And my father hesitated, then said, "We're short about 400,000 to stabilize things." And I felt my eyebrows lift slightly despite myself, because that number wasn't a small favor. That was a life-altering request, even for someone financially comfortable. And my mother rushed to soften it. "It's temporary, just a bridge until one of the investments rebounds." And that sentence alone told me they hadn't learned the lesson yet, because people who keep waiting for rebounds are usually just extending the fall. I leaned back in my chair and looked at them both, really looked, two people who had built their identity on appearing successful while quietly gambling their future away. Two people who had ignored the quiet child who was actually building real stability. And I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since last night. "Is this why you panicked at the party?" And my mother swallowed hard. "Yes." And my father nodded slowly, shame creeping into his eyes. "We didn't expect that to come out." And I almost smiled at the understatement of the year, because of course they didn't expect it. They didn't expect the invisible child to suddenly become visible, competent, powerful, capable of independent success. and now the power dynamics had flipped in a way they weren't emotionally prepared for. And here's where I'm going to be brutally honest with you, the viewer, because this is the part people judge you for if you say it out loud. My first instinct was not compassion, it was boundaries, because when someone who ignored you suddenly needs you, your nervous system doesn't register love, it registers danger, manipulation, conditional worth, and that instinct exists for a reason. I said slowly, "I'm not an emergency fund." And my mother flinched like I'd slapped her. "We're not asking you to be," she protested weakly, and I replied, "That's exactly what you're asking." And the silence after that was thick, heavy, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. And my father rubbed his temples. "We didn't mean it like that." And I nodded, "You never do." And that landed harder than I expected, because sometimes the quiet truth cuts, deeper than shouting ever could. They started explaining how much pressure they were under, the fear of losing the house, the embarrassment, the shame, how they couldn't let their friends know, how it would destroy their image. And I listened, but I didn't feel pulled into their panic, because panic without accountability is just noise. And finally my mother said something that shifted the entire emotional temperature of the room. "Your brother can't find out yet." And I looked at her sharply. "Why?" And she hesitated. "It would upset him." And that's when a bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it, because even now, even in crisis, the golden child's emotional comfort ranked higher than truth, transparency, or responsibility. And I said quietly, "You're more worried about upsetting him than about fixing the problem." And she opened her mouth to argue, and then stopped, because she knew it was true. And suddenly the pattern was crystal clear. They weren't just financially irresponsible. They were emotionally avoidant, conflict-phobic, image-obsessed, willing to sacrifice honesty and long-term stability to preserve short-term comfort and social approval. The same pattern that had made me invisible for years. The same pattern that now had them cornered. And I realized something that both empowered and saddened me. They hadn't changed. The only thing that changed was that their system, finally, hit a breaking point. My father finally asked the question directly, voice low, almost fragile. "Can you help us?" And the room went quiet again, and I felt the weight of that question settle into my chest like a heavy book. Because this wasn't just about money. This was about boundaries, power, self-respect, precedent, and the future of every interaction we'd have from here on out. And I took a slow breath, not answering immediately, because rushed decisions under emotional pressure usually create lifelong regrets. I said, "If I help you, it won't be unconditional." And both of them stiffened slightly. "What does that mean?" my mother asked cautiously, and I leaned forward slightly, meeting their eyes. "It means transparency, accountability, and change. Not secrecy, not image management, not pretending everything is fine while it's falling apart." And my father nodded slowly, absorbing that. "We can do that," he said, quickly, maybe too quickly. The way people promise change when they're desperate, but haven't actually internalized what it requires. And that skepticism settled into my bones like a quiet warning bell. I told them I needed time to review their numbers properly, to think through options, to decide what boundaries made sense. And as I stood to leave, my mother grabbed my hand suddenly, eyes glossy, voice trembling. "We're proud of you," she said softly, and for a split second my chest tightened, that old craving for parental validation flickering like a dying ember. And then the rational part of me kicked in, reminding me that pride spoken only when you're needed is not the same as pride freely given, and I gently withdrew my hand and said, "I hope someday that's true," and walked out. Sitting in my car afterward, engine idling, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling together. Sadness for what they'd built and were about to lose, anger at how they'd handled everything, clarity about the dynamics that shaped my entire upbringing, and something else, something steadier, something like quiet power, because for the first time the leverage wasn't in their hands, it was in mine, not because I wanted control, but because independence naturally creates power in systems that rely on dependency. I drove home thinking about all the invisible children watching this story unfold inside their own families, the ones who learned to self-parent, self-validate, self-build while others were busy being celebrated for mediocrity. And I want you to hear this clearly, because this part matters. When you become successful in silence, people will eventually notice, but not always for the reasons you hope. Sometimes they notice because they need something from you, not because they finally see you. And that moment will test your boundaries, your self-worth, your ability to separate love from leverage. As I pulled into my driveway, phone buzzing again with a text from my brother asking if everything was okay with Mom and Dad, I realized the next phase was coming whether I liked it or not. Because secrets don't stay contained. Once they crack, they spread, they infect conversations, relationships, power structures, and the real reckoning hadn't even started yet, because you're going to see what happened when my brother found out the truth. How the golden child reacted when the hierarchy flipped, and why the emotional fallout became even more explosive than the financial one, because money exposes cracks but ego sets fires. My brother didn't wait long to insert himself into the situation, because golden children rarely tolerate uncertainty when it threatens their position. And by the next afternoon, my phone lit up with his name, vibrating against the kitchen counter while I was halfway through reviewing a research brief. And something in my chest tightened instinctively, because I already knew this conversation wouldn't be about concern or curiosity. It would be about control, about reclaiming the narrative, about making sure whatever shift had happened last night didn't tilt the family axis away from him. And when I answered, he didn't even bother with a greeting, just went straight for the pressure point. "What's going on with Mom and Dad?" His voice sharp, clipped, like a manager demanding a status update from an employee. And I said calmly, "You should ask them." And he scoffed. "They're being weird and evasive. You were there last night. You started all of this." And that word started landed like a spark on gasoline, because it revealed exactly how he framed reality. If something disrupts comfort, someone must be blamed. And in his mind, I was the easiest target. I leaned against the counter and said slowly, "I didn't start anything. Aunt June asked me a question, and I answered honestly." And he snapped back, "You didn't have to flex like that." And I actually laughed, a short, incredulous laugh that surprised even me, because imagine living in a world where honesty about your life is considered showing off simply because no one expected you to have one worth mentioning. And I said, "Owning a house isn't a flex, it's a fact." And he went quiet for half a second, recalibrating, then pivoted like all skilled manipulators do when their first tactic fails. "Look, whatever this is, you don't need to stress them out right now. This is my engagement. This is supposed to be about me and Claire." And there it was again, entitlement wrapped in emotional language, the assumption that the entire family ecosystem should orbit his milestones regardless of what's happening underneath. And I felt that old familiar pressure to shrink, to apologize, to reassure, to smooth things over so the golden child could stay comfortable. And for the first time in my life, I didn't do any of that. I said, "Their stress has nothing to do with your engagement." And he paused, suspicious. "What does that mean?" And I realized this was the moment where the truth would either explode or be dragged into the light slowly. And based on how my parents handled things, I already knew which outcome was coming. So I chose honesty. "They're having financial problems." And the silence on the other end of the line was so sudden it felt like a vacuum. And then he said, "What kind of problems?" His voice suddenly lower, tighter, less performative, and more real. Because money is the one thing that slices through ego faster than anything else. I told him the basics, not numbers yet, not details, just enough to crack the illusion. And as I spoke, I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the mental reorganization of the family hierarchy, the dawning realization that the safety net he subconsciously assumed always existed might be thinner than he thought. And finally he said, "That's not possible. Dad's always been careful with money." And I replied, "Careful doesn't mean wise." And that landed harder than I expected, because he'd grown up worshiping our father's authority, his confidence, his image of control. And now that image was fracturing. He exhaled sharply. "So what are you doing about it?" And there it was, the reflexive expectation that I would fix it, the invisible child suddenly being assigned responsibility, simply because I had resources, competence, or emotional distance. And I said evenly, "I'm thinking," and he scoffed. "Thinking doesn't solve anything." And I felt irritation spark in my chest. "Neither does pretending everything is fine." And he snapped back, "You always do this. You always have to complicate things." And I almost admired the irony of that statement, because the person who had benefited from simplicity and favoritism his entire life couldn't tolerate complexity when it finally arrived. He changed tactics again, voice softening slightly. Look, if they're struggling, we should all step up together. You've always been independent. You don't really need anything from them, but they've done a lot for us. And that sentence revealed so much it almost made me dizzy. The casual dismissal of my emotional needs because I'd learned to self-sustain. The assumption that independence means you don't deserve reciprocity. The rewriting of history to justify unequal treatment. And I said quietly, they didn't do a lot for me. And he paused. What do you mean? And for a split second, I considered opening that entire emotional vault. Years of invisibility, missed milestones, emotional neglect. But I knew this wasn't the moment, because his nervous system wasn't built to handle accountability yet. And I simply said, never mind, which annoyed him even more, because control freaks hate unanswered statements. He pushed, you're being dramatic. And something in me finally snapped, not explosively, but cleanly, like a cord being cut. And I said, you don't get to tell me what my experience was. And the line went quiet again, heavier this time, and he finally muttered, whatever, before hanging up abruptly, and I stood there staring at my phone, feeling that strange combination of sadness and relief. Because that conversation confirmed what I already suspected. He wasn't interested in understanding. He was interested in maintaining comfort, hierarchy, and control. About an hour later, my parents called together on speaker, their voices tense, and my father said, we spoke to your brother. And I said, I know. And my mother added anxiously, he's upset? And I replied calmly, that's not my responsibility. And that sentence alone shifted the energy of the call, because they weren't used to me setting emotional boundaries out loud. And my father said cautiously, he feels blindsided. And I said, so did I for most of my life. And the silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, the kind that forces people to sit with truths they'd rather avoid. My mother tried to soften it. We just want everyone to stay close, to support each other. And I said, support isn't the same as control. And my father sighed, what are you saying? And I answered, I'm saying that if this situation turns into emotional pressure, guilt, or entitlement, I'm stepping back. And they didn't like that answer. I could hear it in the way the line went quiet, because boundaries feel like rejection to people who rely on access and influence. That evening, my brother showed up unannounced at my place, and I watched him through the door camera pacing slightly on my porch. Jaw tight, shoulders rigid, the posture of someone who came to confront, not connect, and part of me considered not opening the door, letting him sit with his own discomfort for once. But I opened it anyway, because avoidance wouldn't resolve the inevitable confrontation. And the second he stepped inside, his eyes scanned the space in that barely disguised way that mixed curiosity, envy, and disbelief. The way someone reacts when the invisible sibling's life turns out to be more substantial than expected. And he muttered, nice place, not a compliment, more like an observation loaded with subtext. And I said, thanks. And we stood there awkwardly for a moment before he finally said, so you're just going to let them drown? And that accusation landed heavy and unfair and emotionally manipulative all at once, and I felt my jaw tighten. I didn't say that. And he shot back, then what are you doing? And I gestured toward the couch, sit down. And he hesitated, then dropped into it like someone bracing for impact. I sat across from him and said slowly, I'm not responsible for fixing their choices. And he leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes intense. They're our parents. And I replied, and I'm their child too? And something flickered across his face, confusion maybe, or discomfort, because in his mind, I'd always been secondary, background, supplementary, not an equal emotional entity. He shook his head. You're making this about you. And I felt anger rise for the first time in this entire ordeal, hot and sharp. It is about me, I said firmly. It's about the fact that the only time I seem to matter in this family is when someone needs something. And he scoffed, that's not true. And I looked him dead in the eye and said, name one time in the last 5 years you asked me how my life was going. And he opened his mouth and closed it, then looked away because he couldn't. And that silence was louder than any argument. He shifted uncomfortably. That's not fair. And I replied, neither was being invisible. And we sat there in heavy silence for a moment, the air thick with everything that had never been said between us. And then he did what golden children often do when their identity feels threatened. He went on the offensive emotionally, so now you're better than us. And I felt something inside me harden, not defensively, but decisively. No, I said calmly. I'm just not smaller than you anymore. And that sentence landed like a brick through glass, because his entire sense of stability relied on me being smaller, quieter, less relevant, and now that hierarchy had collapsed. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. This is insane, he muttered. Everything was fine, and I replied. Everything looked fine, and that distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. He stopped pacing and looked at me with a mixture of frustration and something else, something close to fear. So what? You're just going to sit on your pile of money while they lose everything? And I said, I'm going to make decisions based on boundaries and accountability, not guilt. And he laughed bitterly. You've always been cold. And that hurt more than I expected, because that label had followed me my whole life, the quiet one, the detached one, the serious one, when in reality I'd just learned early that vulnerability wasn't rewarded in this family. And I said softly, I'm not cold, I'm careful. And he didn't respond because that required self-reflection he wasn't ready for. He eventually left without resolution, without apology, without understanding, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the room. And I stood there in the quiet aftermath, heart pounding slightly, realizing that this wasn't just a financial reckoning for my parents. It was an identity reckoning for my brother, and those are often uglier and more emotionally volatile than money ever is. Later that night, my mother texted me asking if everything was okay after his visit, and I typed and erased 3 different responses before finally sending. We talked, because I wasn't interested in being the emotional middleman anymore, and I went to bed feeling that strange blend of exhaustion and clarity that comes when long-suppressed dynamics finally surface. And here's the part I want you to sit with for a second, because this applies far beyond my family. When a system is built on favoritism, invisibility, and unspoken roles, the moment one person changes, the entire system destabilizes, not because change is bad, but because the system was fragile to begin with, propped up by silence and compliance, and when that compliance ends, everyone scrambles. I lay there in the dark, thinking about the irony of it all, how my quiet independence, the very thing that made me invisible for years, had now made me the gravitational center of a crisis I didn't create, and I realized something important about power. Real power isn't loud. It's not controlling. It's not manipulative. It's the ability to walk away from dynamics that don't respect you. And that realization scared me a little, because it meant I was no longer emotionally dependent on their approval or comfort, and that changes everything. The next morning, my father called with a request that made my stomach drop, because it confirmed exactly where this was heading. And you're going to hear the moment they crossed a line that forced me to decide whether this family relationship could actually be repaired or whether I needed to finally protect my peace at all costs. Because what he asked of me wasn't just financial, it was moral, and that's where everything truly came to a head. The next morning, my father's name flashed on my phone again, and before I even answered, my nervous system already knew this call was different, heavier, more loaded. The kind of call where someone is about to ask you to compromise something inside yourself, not just your bank account. And when I picked up, he didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. His voice was tight, controlled, too controlled, like a man rehearsing a difficult sentence in his head before finally saying it out loud. We've been talking, he said, and that phrase alone carried 1,000 unspoken negotiations, whispered fears, and late-night rationalizations. And I replied calmly, about what? Even though I could feel the answer forming in the pit of my stomach, and he hesitated for just half a second too long before continuing, about how to stabilize things without making this public. And there it was, the real priority exposed again, not solving the root problem, not accountability, not long-term, sustainability, but preserving the illusion, keeping the story clean, protecting the image, and I felt that familiar cold clarity settle over me like armor. He continued, we think it would be best if the money came through you directly, quietly, so it doesn't raise any flags with the rest of the family or our friends. And my grip tightened slightly around the phone, because that wasn't just a financial request anymore. That was a moral request, a request to participate in the same secrecy and deception that built this mess in the first place. And I said, slowly, you want me to help you hide this? And he rushed in quickly, not hide, just manage. Privately, there's no need to alarm people unnecessarily. And that sentence right there was the line they crossed, because when people redefine hiding as managing, they're already justifying dishonesty as responsibility. I closed my eyes for a second and took a slow breath, because part of me could already feel the old conditioning trying to surface, the urge to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, the easy one, the invisible one who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to. And I consciously pushed against that instinct, because growth doesn't come from comfort, it comes from boundaries. I said clearly, I won't lie for you. And the silence on the other end of the line was immediate and thick, like the air had been sucked out of the conversation. And after a few seconds, he said, it's not lying. And I replied, it's hiding the truth so you can keep pretending nothing's wrong. And his voice hardened slightly. You don't understand how this would look? And that made me almost laugh, because that sentence perfectly summarized the entire problem. They cared more about how it would look than what it actually was. And I said, I understand exactly how it would look. That's why I won't do it. He shifted tactics then, like all practice persuaders do, softening his tone, invoking emotion instead of logic. We're your parents, he said quietly. We're scared. We're trying to protect what we've built. And I replied, you're trying to protect how you appear, not what you built. And that distinction mattered, because what they'd actually built was fragile, debt-heavy, dependent on perception rather than substance. And the same pattern had existed emotionally in our family for years. Love based on optics, validation based on performance, connection based on convenience. He sighed heavily. So you're just going to let us fall? And that was the emotional guilt dagger, sharp and aimed straight at the heart. And I felt the flicker of old guilt try to surface, that familiar childhood reflex of taking responsibility for adult emotions that were never mine to manage. And I consciously grounded myself, feeling my feet against the floor, my breath steady, reminding myself that guilt isn't the same as responsibility. And I said calmly, I'm willing to help, but not if. It requires me to become part of the problem. Another pause, longer this time, heavier. And then he said something that shocked me with its bluntness. Your brother can't know how bad it really is. And my stomach dropped slightly, because now the manipulation was expanding, the secrecy web widening. And I said sharply, why not? And he replied, it would destabilize him. He's already stressed with the engagement. This could derail everything. And I felt anger rise in my chest like a slow burn, because even now, even in financial freefall, the golden child's emotional comfort still outranked truth, accountability, and fairness. And I said, so the solution is to make me complicit in protecting him from reality, while you use my resources to fix your mistakes. And he didn't deny it, because he couldn't, and that silence said everything. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the quiet street, feeling the weight of the decision crystallize in my body. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about whether I was willing to sacrifice my integrity to preserve a dysfunctional family system that had already cost me years of invisibility. And I heard myself say something I didn't even consciously plan, but felt deeply true. If my help requires secrecy, then you don't get my help. And his voice tightened. Immediately, you're being rigid. And I replied, I'm being honest. And that contrast mattered more than he wanted to admit. He tried one last angle. Do you really want to be the reason your parents lose their home? And that sentence hit like a punch to the chest, because it weaponized fear and responsibility in one neat package. And for a brief moment, I felt the old emotional gravity tugging at me again, that child part that wanted to rescue, to fix, to earn love through sacrifice. And then another part of me stepped forward, calmer, steadier, the adult who had built an independent life precisely so I wouldn't be trapped in these dynamics. And I said evenly, your choices put your home at risk, not my boundaries. And he didn't respond immediately, because that truth had nowhere to hide. We ended the call without resolution, the tension unresolved, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud that hadn't yet broken. And I stood there for a long moment afterward, phone in hand, heart beating a little faster than normal, realizing that I had just drawn the hardest line I'd ever drawn with my parents, a line that separated help from enablement, love from control, honesty from illusion. And here's where I want to bring you into my head for a second, because this part isn't clean or noble or Instagram inspirational. It's messy, conflicted, human. Part of me still wanted to help them financially because they're my parents, and I'm not immune to attachment, not immune to empathy, not immune to that ancient pull of family loyalty. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being unseen, whispered something darker and truer. If you bail them out without boundaries, you teach them that ignoring you has no consequences and that your worth only exists when you're useful. And that's a contract I was no longer willing to sign. My phone buzzed a few minutes later with a text from my mother. "Your father said you were upset." And I stared at the message, noticing how even now the narrative was being shaped, softened, redirected, and I typed back, "I'm not upset, I'm being clear." And she replied almost instantly, "We're just trying to survive this." And that word survive lingered in my mind, because survival language often gets used to justify unethical behavior, secrecy, emotional pressure, manipulation, and I wrote back, "Surviving doesn't require lying." And the typing bubbles appeared and disappeared several times before she finally sent, "You don't understand how humiliating this would be." And I felt something inside me snap cleanly into place, because there it was, the real motivator laid bare. Humiliation, not ethics, not responsibility, not long-term stability, image. And I replied, "Humiliation is the cost of pretending you're something you're not," and set the phone down because I was done negotiating with fear disguised as pride. That afternoon, my brother texted me, "Dad says you're being difficult." And I could almost hear the framing happening in real time, me becoming the obstacle, the villain, the disruptive comfort. And I replied simply, "I'm being honest." And he shot back, "You always think you're right." And I stared at that message, feeling a sad smile tug at my lips, because that accusation had followed me my whole life. Not because I was arrogant, but because I refused to distort reality to make others comfortable. And I typed back, "I think honesty matters more than comfort," and left it at that. That evening, Aunt June called again, her voice sharp with concern. "They're trying to rope you into keeping this quiet, aren't they?" And I exhaled slowly, yes, and she sighed. "Don't do it," she said firmly. "I've watched families destroy themselves over secrets that were supposed to protect reputations. It never ends well." And hearing that external validation grounded me further, because sometimes you need a witness outside the system to confirm that you're not crazy for refusing. Dysfunction. I sat alone in my living room later that night, lights dimmed, city sounds drifting in through the windows, reflecting on how strange life is, how one accidental question at a party can crack open decades of carefully maintained illusion, how power shifts when silence breaks, how the invisible child suddenly becomes the one with leverage, and how uncomfortable that transition feels for everyone involved. I thought about the concept of family loyalty that gets thrown around like a moral weapon, the idea that you owe unconditional sacrifice simply because you share DNA, and I challenged that belief honestly inside myself, asking whether loyalty without mutual respect is actually love or just conditioning, whether protecting someone's image at the cost of your integrity is kindness or cowardice, whether silence that enables harm is peace or avoidance. And those questions didn't have easy answers, but they had honest ones, and honesty was something I'd decided to stop compromising on. Late that night, my father sent one more message, shorter, colder. "We're disappointed you're not being supportive." And I stared at that sentence for a long time, feeling the old sting of parental disapproval try to flare, and then watching it fade more quickly than it ever had before, because something inside me had shifted permanently. I no longer needed their approval to validate my worth or my choices. And I replied, "Support doesn't mean surrendering my integrity," and turned the phone, face down. And here's the thing I want you, the viewer, to really sit with, because this is where a lot of people get stuck in their own lives. Sometimes the hardest betrayal isn't when someone hurts you openly. It's when they ask you to become complicit in their dysfunction, when they ask you to carry secrets that protect their comfort while costing you your boundaries, your peace, your self-respect. And that's where real adulthood begins. Not when you make money, not when you move out, not when you succeed, but when you can say no to emotional contracts that no longer serve your integrity. I didn't know yet how my parents would respond to that boundary, whether they'd double down, manipulate harder, or finally confront reality. But I could feel the next wave building, because when people who rely on control lose leverage, they don't usually surrender quietly. They escalate, they test, they push, and you're going to see exactly how that escalation unfolded, how the pressure intensified, how alliances shifted, and how one unexpected revelation forced the entire family to confront consequences they could no longer hide from, because this story wasn't done cracking open yet, not even close. The escalation didn't come the way I expected, not with yelling or dramatic ultimatums or even emotional breakdowns. It came quietly, strategically, like a chess move made by someone who finally realized they were losing control of the board. Because 3 days after I refused to participate in secrecy, I got an email from my father that wasn't emotional at all. It was formal, carefully worded, almost legal in tone, and the subject line alone made my stomach tighten. Family financial. Clarification, which already told me everything I needed to know about the mindset behind it, and when I opened it, he'd laid out a proposal like a contract, bullet points, timelines, repayment assumptions, and most importantly, a subtle reframe of reality that positioned them as reasonable negotiators, and me as the stubborn outlier who needed to be persuaded back into alignment. He wrote that they had consulted with a financial advisor who believed a private family loan structure would minimize reputational exposure and protect long-term relational harmony, and I almost laughed out loud at how professionally sanitized the manipulation had become, because when people start dressing emotional pressure up in corporate language, they're not interested in truth, they're interested in compliance. He proposed that I loan the money to them instead of directly to my brother, that the paperwork would stay internal, that no one outside the immediate household would need to know, and that repayment would be structured over a long term to reduce strain, which in real language meant I'd probably never see that money again, and I'd be locked into a quiet obligation that preserved their image while eroding my boundaries. I reread the email slowly, feeling a strange mix of anger and clarity, because this wasn't panic anymore. This was entitlement trying to regain leverage through structure and pressure. And the deeper betrayal wasn't even the money request itself. It was the assumption that I would eventually fold, that my no was temporary, negotiable, flexible, something they could wear down if they applied enough rational packaging and emotional subtext. I forwarded the email to Aunt June with one line, "Thoughts?" and her response came back within minutes. "They're trying to outsmart you instead of respect you. Don't fall for it." And that outside perspective kept me grounded, because when you grow up inside a family system like this, you can slowly lose your calibration for what healthy boundaries actually look like. That same afternoon, my brother showed up at my office building unannounced, which already set off internal alarms because he'd never shown interest in my professional life before, never cared where I worked, what I did, or what mattered to me. And suddenly he was standing in the lobby texting me that he was downstairs and wanted to talk. I debated ignoring him, but part of me wanted to see what angle he'd take now, what emotional card they'd send in next, because families don't usually stop at one attempt when they smell leverage. They cycle through guilt, charm, pressure, victimhood, and eventually aggression if they don't get compliance. I met him in the lobby cafe, the polished marble floors reflecting city light, professionals moving briskly around us, and the contrast between my actual world and his sudden intrusion into it felt almost symbolic. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, tapping his fingers on the table, not meeting my eyes at first, and finally he said, "You didn't have to make this so complicated." And I smiled slightly, because that sentence alone revealed his entire frame. Complicated for who? Inconvenient for what system? Disruptive to which comfort? I replied calmly, "I didn't make anything complicated. I said no to secrecy." And he shook his head. "You always turn everything into some moral crusade." And there it was, the familiar minimizing narrative, framing boundaries as drama, integrity as stubbornness, truth as inconvenience. And I leaned back slightly and said, "If honesty feels like a crusade to you, that says more about what you're protecting than what I'm demanding." He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." And I couldn't help myself. I laughed softly, not cruelly, but honestly. You mean the pressure of living beyond your means and being exposed for it. And his jaw tightened. That's not fair, he snapped, and I replied, neither was being invisible for years while you were celebrated for existing. The words landed heavier than I intended, but they were true, and sometimes truth doesn't care about comfort. He leaned forward, voice dropping. If you help us quietly, this all goes away. No one has to know. Mom and Dad don't get humiliated. I don't look like a failure. You get your money back eventually. Everyone wins. And I looked at him and said slowly, everyone wins except my integrity, my boundaries, and the truth. And he scoffed, you're being dramatic. And I replied, you're being avoidant. Silence stretched between us for a moment, thick with unresolved history. And then he said something that finally revealed the emotional core of this entire mess. You like this, don't you? And I raised an eyebrow. Like what? And he said bitterly, being the one with power for once, watching everyone scramble, watching me finally look small instead of you. And that sentence hit deeper than anything else he'd said, because it exposed the unspoken sibling rivalry that had quietly shaped our dynamic for years, the unbalanced scoreboard where he'd always been praised and I'd always been overlooked, and now the roles had flipped and neither of us fully knew how to handle it. I didn't deny it, because denial would have been dishonest. I said quietly, I don't like seeing you struggle, but I do like that the truth is finally visible, that I'm not invisible anymore. And he swallowed hard. So this is revenge. And I shook my head. No, this is reality catching up. He stood abruptly, frustration radiating off him. If you don't help, you're going to tear this family apart. And I met his eyes steadily. If honesty tears it apart, it was already broken. He left without another word, the glass doors sliding shut behind him, and I sat there for a long moment feeling the emotional residue of the exchange settle in my chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Just a sober awareness that lines had been crossed that couldn't easily be uncrossed, that the illusion of harmony was officially dead, and whatever came next would be built on truth or not built at all. That night, the Real bomb dropped because I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a calm professional voice introduced himself as a representative from a regional lending firm, confirming my name and asking if I was related to my parents, and my nervous system immediately lit up because when financial institutions start calling extended family members, it usually means things are worse than anyone admitted. He explained that my parents had co-signed a line of credit that was now in default due to mispayments, and that legal action was being prepared if a resolution wasn't reached within 30 days. And suddenly the entire puzzle snapped into focus. This wasn't just about my brother's reckless debt. This was about my parents quietly overextending themselves as well, propping up an unsustainable lifestyle while maintaining appearances, and now the structure was collapsing from multiple directions at once. I thanked the caller, declined to provide any personal financial information, and ended the call, feeling a cold heaviness settle into my stomach, because now the stakes had escalated from emotional manipulation to real legal consequences. And the reason my parents were panicking so aggressively wasn't just image. It was survival layered on top of denial. I called Aunt June immediately and told her what happened, and she exhaled sharply. I suspected something like this, she said. People don't scramble that hard unless there's more under the surface. And she was right, because the more people hide, the more fragile the structure becomes, and eventually gravity wins. I debated whether to tell my parents that I knew about the default, but something told me to wait, to observe, to let them reveal how honest they were willing to be without being cornered, because truth revealed voluntarily tells you more about character than truth dragged out under pressure. The next morning, my mother called again, voice unusually subdued, softer than it had been in days. We need to talk, she said, and I could hear exhaustion underneath her words, not theatrical, not manipulative, just tired. And I agreed to meet them at their house that evening, because at this point, avoidance wasn't going to protect anyone from what was unfolding. Walking into my childhood home felt surreal. The familiar furniture, the framed photos of my brother's milestones lining the walls, trophies, awards, celebrations, while my own achievements were almost entirely absent, and that visual alone reinforced everything that had been bubbling to the surface over the past week. They sat across from me at the dining table, hands clasped tightly, posture tense, and my father spoke first. "We didn't tell you everything," and I nodded slowly, "I know," and his eyes widened slightly, "How?" And I said calmly, "Your lender called me," and the color drained from my mother's face immediately, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with fear, and my father closed his eyes briefly, like a man bracing for impact. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with years of hidden choices, deferred consequences, and unspoken fear, and finally my mother whispered, "We were trying to fix it before anyone found out," and I replied, gently but firmly, "That's what got you here." They confessed then, fully, the loans, the co-signing, the quiet juggling of payments, the denial, the belief that everything would somehow stabilize if they just kept appearances intact long enough. And as they spoke, I didn't feel anger as much as sadness, because I could see clearly how deeply their identity was tied to external validation, how terrified they were of looking like anything less than successful, stable, admired, and how that fear had driven decision after decision that eroded reality instead of strengthening it. My father finally said quietly, "We don't know how to fix this." And I looked at them and felt something shift, not superiority, not control, but responsibility paired with clarity, and I said, "Fixing it starts with truth, not secrecy." And they nodded slowly, defeated but listening, and I continued, "You need to speak with a financial attorney, not a reputation manager. You need to restructure honestly, not cosmetically, and you need to accept that some discomfort is unavoidable when you've delayed accountability for this long." My mother's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't performative. They were real, quiet, humbled, and she said, "We were so afraid of looking like failures." And I replied softly, "Failure isn't debt. Failure is refusing to face reality." That conversation didn't magically fix anything, but it cracked open something important, because for the first time, the illusion had fully collapsed. There was no more pretending, no more spinning, no more managing perception, only consequences and responsibility. And here's where the story takes another turn that I didn't expect, because the following week, my parents informed the extended family about the financial strain themselves, not with full details, but honestly enough to dismantle the perfect image they'd protected for years. And the reactions were mixed. Some relatives offered support, others distanced themselves. A few judged quietly, but the world didn't end, the sky didn't fall. The humiliation they'd feared turned out to be survivable. And that realization alone was a quiet lesson in how fear magnifies imagined consequences far beyond reality. My brother, however, struggled deeply with the loss of image, the shift in status, the discomfort of being seen as flawed instead of flawless, and we had several tense conversations where resentment surfaced, jealousy flared, and old wounds reopened. But slowly, painfully, honesty began to replace performance in ways that felt awkward but real. And through all of this, I stayed grounded in one core truth. I was not responsible for fixing the emotional or financial consequences of years of denial. I could offer support without surrendering my boundaries. I could participate in solutions without participating in deception, and that distinction protected my sense of self in a way I'd never experienced before. But what none of us anticipated was the final catalyst that would force the ultimate reckoning, because just when things felt like they were stabilizing into a new, uncomfortable honesty, a legal notice arrived that accelerated everything. A deadline that couldn't be negotiated away, a consequence that demanded immediate action. And you're going to see exactly how that final pressure exposed the true priorities of everyone involved, who chose accountability, who chose ego, and who finally understood the real cost of pretending, because this story wasn't done revealing its deepest lesson yet. The legal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain white envelope that looked harmless until you understood what it represented. The kind of mail that doesn't announce itself with drama, but carries consequences heavy enough to tilt entire family systems. And when my mother called me with a voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the phone, I already knew this was the moment everything we'd been circling finally collided. She didn't cry this time, didn't plead, didn't manipulate. She simply said, "The lender accelerated the timeline," and my nervous system instantly registered the shift. Acceleration means panic on the other side of contracts. Acceleration means the safety net has officially been removed. Acceleration means the consequences no one wanted to face are now standing in the doorway with paperwork instead of warnings. They had 14 days to resolve the default or face legal action that would impact their home, their remaining credit lines, and potentially expose every layered financial shortcut they'd been quietly stacking for years. And suddenly the abstract idea of accountability became concrete, measurable, unavoidable. And this is where you learn who people really are, not when things are comfortable, not when apologies are easy, but when pressure strips away image management and forces alignment between words and actions. We met at their house again that evening. The same dining table, the same family photos lining the walls like a museum of selective memory. But the energy in the room was different now, quieter, heavier, more honest. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him. Shoulders slightly slumped, eyes tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And my mother held her tea with both hands like it was grounding her to the chair. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible one in the room. I wasn't background noise. I wasn't an afterthought. I was central to the conversation, not because of money alone, but because clarity changes power dynamics, whether anyone likes it or not. My father spoke first, voice steady but subdued. We've decided to sell the lake property. And that alone told me something important had shifted, because for years that property had been part of their identity, a symbol of success they rarely used but loved to reference socially, and letting go of it meant letting go of a piece of the image they'd been protecting at all costs. He continued, "We're also downsizing this house and moving closer to the city." And my mother nodded slowly, eyes damp but composed. "It's time," she said quietly, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief, because they were finally choosing reality over appearance. Sadness, because sometimes growth only arrives after pain forces the door open. My brother sat across from us, posture stiff, jaw tight, clearly struggling with the emotional weight of watching the family narrative unravel in real time. And he finally spoke. "So what happens with the rest of the debt?" And my father looked at me, not pleading, not pressuring, just honest. "We'll cover what we can after the sales, but there will still be a gap." And I didn't respond immediately, because this was the moment where everything I'd been protecting, everything I'd been building internally, everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-worth and power would be tested under real emotional gravity. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the room settle into my chest, and said calmly, "I'll help bridge the remaining gap under one condition." And all three of them leaned in slightly, not desperate, not entitled, but attentive, and that alone felt like a quiet victory. "This isn't a bailout," I continued. "This is a structured loan with legal documentation, repayment plans, and full transparency. No secrecy, no hidden expectations, no emotional leverage. And if those terms ever get violated, I step away completely, no renegotiation." And my father nodded immediately, agreed. My mother followed softly, agreed. And my brother hesitated for half a second before nodding too, agreed. And that pause told me everything about how hard this was for him, how much pride he was swallowing, how much identity he was releasing in that moment. But here's the deeper truth that mattered more than the paperwork. I wasn't doing this to save them from discomfort. I wasn't doing this to preserve their image. I wasn't doing this to finally earn their approval. I was doing it because I chose to operate from strength instead of resentment, because power used consciously heals more than power used reactively, and because sometimes the most radical boundary isn't cutting people off. It's teaching them how to treat you correctly through consistency instead of collapse. The following weeks were exhausting in ways success never prepared me for. Meetings with attorneys, financial restructuring sessions, property listings, uncomfortable conversations with extended family who suddenly learned that perfection had cracks. And through it all, I watched my parents slowly recalibrate their identity away from performance and toward presence, away from status and toward substance. My mother stopped hosting elaborate social gatherings and started volunteering at a community literacy center, something she'd always wanted to do but never prioritized because it didn't come with applause. My father began consulting part-time instead of chasing legacy roles, rediscovering satisfaction in mentoring younger professionals instead of accumulating titles. And my brother entered genuine financial counseling and therapy, confronting the pressure he'd internalized from being the golden child who always had to appear successful even when reality didn't support it. And me, I stayed anchored in my own life, my work, my values, my routines. I didn't move back into old emotional patterns. I didn't overfunction for them. I didn't manage their feelings or absorb their guilt. I stayed steady, supportive but separate, loving but boundaried, and that distinction quietly reshaped every interaction moving forward. There were awkward moments, uncomfortable silences, missteps, small regressions, but overall, the trajectory shifted toward honesty instead of illusion, and that alone changed the emotional temperature of our family in ways no amount of money ever could. 6 months later, we sat together again, not for crisis management, not for damage control, but for a simple dinner at my place, no spectacle, no posturing, no performances, just food, conversation, laughter, and something that resembled genuine connection rather than scripted interaction. And my father raised his glass and said something I never thought I'd hear. "To seeing what was always in front of us." And my mother added quietly, "And to learning how to love without blinders." And my brother looked at me and said, "Thank you for not letting us keep lying to ourselves." And that moment landed differently than any apology ever could, because it reflected accountability rather than guilt, growth rather than damage control, awareness rather than performance. And here's the part I want you to really hear, not as entertainment, not as revenge fantasy, but as truth rooted in lived experience. Being overlooked doesn't mean you're invisible in reality. It means you're invisible to people who are distracted by their own projections, their own fears, their own narratives, their own limitations, and that's not your burden to carry. Your value doesn't require witnesses to exist. Your growth doesn't need applause to matter. Your progress doesn't require permission to continue. I built my life quietly while my family wasn't paying attention, not because I wanted to prove them wrong originally, but because I refused to shrink just because no one was watching. And when they finally noticed, when reality forced recognition, the power didn't come from making them feel small. It came from choosing how I wanted to show up in that moment, from deciding whether to lead with resentment or clarity, from recognizing that boundaries protect relationships better than sacrifice ever could. If you're watching this and you're the invisible one in your family, the overlooked sibling, the quiet achiever, the one whose milestones go unnoticed while someone else's mediocrity gets celebrated like a championship parade, I want you to understand something deeply. You're not behind. You're not less. You're not missing anything essential. You are building something internally and externally that will outlast applause cycles, popularity rankings, and fragile egos, and someday, whether they notice or not, you'll stand inside the life you created and realize that your worth was never dependent on their validation in the first place. Let me ask you something directly, because I want this conversation to live beyond the screen. Did my parents cross a line by ignoring me for years and only showing interest when money entered the picture? Or do you believe family deserves unconditional forgiveness, no matter the pattern? Where do you draw the line between loyalty and self-respect? And if you've ever been the invisible one in your own family, what did that teach you about yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations matter more than people admit. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their quiet progress still counts. And if you want to continue this journey into stories about power shifts, family dynamics, silent success, and what happens when truth finally breaks through illusion, make sure you're subscribed and head straight to the next video we discussed, because it dives even deeper into how invisible people reclaim their power without becoming bitter. And trust me, you don't want to miss that one.